Hi everybody, can everybody hear me? Great. So for those of you who've seen the publicity, I'm Channel 4's Lindsay Hilsum. For those of you who watch Channel 4, I'm not Lindsay Hilsum. She can't make it, unfortunately. She's been called off to do some reporting. James Copnall from the BBC. I was the BBC Sudan correspondent a few years ago. We've got a fantastic panel to discuss Sudan and the Post-Bashir years, the revolution. Well, not years yet, days, weeks. Othaylat Suliman, chair of the Sudanese Journalist Forum, who I think I met 10 years ago in Khartoum, possibly, something like that. Bring great depth of knowledge to the topic. Yousra Elbagir from Channel 4 has been doing some of the most poignant and powerful reporting on the ground in Sudan over the last few months. Fans in the building, I can hear already. 6 months ago, late last year, it looked like Mohanad Hashim would stay in power till he died, probably. He'd been around for nearly 3 decades. The country was in an economic crisis. There were the first tentative protests, but no one really thought there was going to be dramatic change. By April, mid-April, April the 11th, he'd been deposed by some of his closest allies. Then it seemed like protesters were reimagining a new Sudan. And then on June the 3rd, you had a very brutal crackdown, and now the future of that revolution is very much in question. So those are some of the big themes we're going to be talking about today. And I wanted to start with the sit-in. First of all, this is the huge crowd of people. You can see some of the pictures up there on that screen. And I should say that this is being live streamed, this event, so people can follow it around the world. So be aware of that if we want to make comments, questions a little bit later on, or photos coming shortly, I think. The sit-in was a gathering of people outside the military headquarters from April the 6th that led to Mohanad Hashim being overthrown and seemed to hold out great promise for a future of Sudan and also rethinking of the country in many profound ways. You spent quite a lot of time there. I wonder if you could start, Yousra, by just describing a little bit.
I don't think it's like anything that anyone has ever seen. Ever. I don't even think pictures or words could really encapsulate what that space meant. It was the most magical place, but it was also so organized. I don't think people realize how organized it was. So you walk in and you're searched. If you're a woman, you stand in the women's line. If you're a man, you go to the men. And they're already chanting, you know, Kandaka this way, Nubian Queen, Shafata, Bejai. And it was just, it felt like everything that embodied everything that was beautiful about the Sudanese community. And I think anyone who went sort of got addicted to that feeling of sort of liberation and equality. I mean, there were definitely cases of sort of aggression that you would see every now and then, but it was such an anomaly compared to how much kindness and how much sort of generosity. You know, even Ramadan was a great example because everyone would sort of bring their food, break fast together, women sort of in the corners bring all their food around the sort of big pots. I can't explain how big these pots were. And then it was ripped away. And I don't think what they did by doing that was so unbelievably profound and cruel, you know. But I think most importantly, one of the things that I won't forget is that an amazing artist called Jalal Yusuf had done these series of murals around the sit-in, and one of them was these men and women standing in a row, and they had like red paint over their mouths. And he said to me, because we were having an amazing night of like culture and celebration, and these guys had cleaned this area that was an open sort of dumpster and made it into this arts corner. And he was like, I don't want people to forget what people went through and what was lost to have this space. And so when I woke up that morning and had seen that the sit-in had been so brutally and lethally dispersed, I just kept seeing that painting again and again and thinking about sort of what had happened, and the fact that people were sort of so caught up in this moment in time and didn't realize that it could be so easily snatched away.
We can get to the crackdown, the dispersal of the sit-in in a second. I want to just take a little bit of time maybe with Othaylat, thinking about the sit-in as a place where freedom of speech was permitted in a way that it hadn't been for decades, where people could say what they want, discuss what they want, argue, debate, remake Sudan.
I think it must have been amazing after 30 years to suddenly have political seminars. They had their own radio station, and to just to feel that you have taken over, totally empowered after so many years of not being able to organize even anything cultural, let alone political, event. And it was, for me here from the diaspora, obviously we're following everything was really amazing.
And not just following, the diaspora is also playing a role in sending money for food, for water, for organising for the protest.
Yes, there was a lot of organisation from the syndicates and the unions providing a lot of support. I'm following keenly everything that was going on.
And sharing.
And a lot of sharing a lot in the groups,
I found walking around it, one of the most startling things was the organisation. So if you just think a little bit about this huge area of space, thousands, at some point maybe tens of thousands of people there, camped outside the military headquarters, their presence is the pressure on the military. The reason why Mohanad Hashim was overthrown, the reason why the military are engaging in negotiations with the civilian protesters. But just think about a space with that many people in it and what you need to do to get rid of the rubbish, to bring in water, to clean the streets. There was a school set up for street children so that they could take part in the revolution too, so that they could be part of it. It was a very powerful little community, Yousra.
Yeah, I mean, there were clinics.
The mobile clinics,
the mobile clinics. There were, there was a library. In the arts corner, there was an actual library with free books. This wonderful man had set it up, and he said that anyone could take any book that they wanted. And I think it wasn't just a place to have fun and listen to music. There were mobile sort of awareness, sort of think of Speaker's Corner, but like in every sort of corner, there were people talking about the Sudan they wanted to see, what they called it the Enlightenment Revolution. How can we not just change our government, but change our consciousness and change the things about Sudanese society that may have helped get to this point in history.
So you saw, for example, people from what they call in Sudanese context the marginalised peripheries, the areas of the far-flung periphery of the country which have been haven't got enough resources, political power, have been discriminated against, coming to Khartoum, coming to the capital, talking to people, saying, we've been discriminated against. You didn't speak up when we were being killed in Darfur.
Yeah. Well, there was a huge procession that came from Darfur. Around like 1,500 people came from Darfur. And that was a momentous moment. Like that was people, everyone was cheering. They were like, we are all Darfur. And the reason they felt like they had to come, because they felt like people were overlooking Hemedti, for example, the vice chair of the Transitional Military Council, his role in atrocities in Darfur. They felt like if we don't come and make our presence known, our sort of values and our needs will be forgotten. And they were being forgotten at that time.
But I think, the chant that we are all Darfur was also to reaffirm, the rights, but also to say, to pledge, solidarity.
Yeah.
Because they were criticized initially, and these are just, trying to dismiss. The official line has always been to be dismissive. And what was interesting is that while the informal media and international media even were perhaps not always focusing, but more so than the official media, the complete silence by the official media and the always trying to portray it as something insignificant, focusing on the side streets and not the square, and sort of ignoring what was going on.
And that conversation that Yousra was talking about race and religion and politics and the roles of different regions, why had it been so hard for Sudanese to have that conversation before, for decades before?
I think because there's an inherent, there's a lot of racism in Sudan. There's a lot of Arab supremacy. We were colonized, so there's white supremacy. And I think Sudanese people didn't want to have to face the divides and the inequalities in Sudanese society for a long time. So I think one of the things that people always say to me is, we never even imagined that Darfur could have happened until we saw it come to the capital. People didn't even believe that, you know, these atrocities were committed in Darfur until they saw the scale of it, or at least a small portion of what had been committed in Darfur in the capital. And there was an amnesia when Hemedti, Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, was made the vice chair of the Transitional Military Council. People wanted to believe that this man could bring the country together, could bring the country into an era of democracy, when he had done, not just in Darfur, in South Kordofan and Blue Nile State, committed horrible crimes against humanity. And so that We Are All Darfur chant was very selective, in my opinion. It was when they felt like we have to band together to fight the regime. But when this man is made the de facto VP of the country, it was completely forgotten until his troops started shooting people in the capital.
I think with Hemedti, it was a question of people saying maybe he's a bitter pill to swallow for the sake of the future, because perhaps people were misled by him appearing in the Maidan, and I think initially people thought that he was siding with them, and that he's on the side of the protesters and on the side of the revolution. And with regards to the dialogue within Sudan, maybe there's inherent racism, but I think people forget about the scale, physically, of how large Sudan is. For me to physically go to Darfur, I have to fly for 3 hours from Khartoum. And I think it's also, so it's not as accessible for somebody to really travel and so on. But to forget that also during 30 years, that it was really difficult to organize any kind of political forum for discussions. I mean, you had, of course, a few centers that were, with huge efforts to have debate and so on. But by and large, this is not encouraged. So with little funding to also for joint projects and so on, because if you want to have a national project, then you need to fund such things, cultural activities, political activities, and so on.
And all of that was extremely difficult, not just under Al-Bashir, but under previous governments. So I wonder if we could maybe go back to the start of the protest. How did we get to this sit-in, this moment of sort of revolutionary optimism and idealism, which has been partially snuffed out now? Take us back, if you would, to December. What were the first protesters striking out against?
People called them bread protests, which was incorrect. It was I would say half correct, because I think the lines for fuel, the lines for bread, the lines for cash were a triggering moment for people, because for months people, even in the diaspora, we were seeing videos of these lines of cars to get fuel, and the economy had really hit rock bottom. So that did trigger people who may not have necessarily been politically engaged, may not necessarily have cared whether the regime stayed or went, but they felt like they weren't going to survive either way. And that's why you saw so many people come out. But also, the regime's corruption became so brazen. It's like people can't even eat, and you're seeing these Land Cruisers of government officials drive by. So it was a triggering moment for everyone, because all these bouts of unrest since 2009 had been very quickly diminished. But this was life or death for people, and people were willing to die this time.
Because the economy was so bad.
Because surviving was so difficult.
And the economic collapse in Sudan is closely linked to the political, because of South Sudan seceding in 2011, taking with the oil reserves, because of incredibly high spending on the military security apparatus, 60-70%, because you can't get international debt relief or loans from the World Bank, with al-Bashir, for example, wanted by the ICC.
Sanctions not impacting the government because of loopholes, but impacting people.
So the economy is essentially a political issue in Sudan as much as
issue. But when I think about, when you read that the UAE gave Sudan, I think, $6 billion or something for participating in the war in Yemen, and even that, you think, what did they do with that money? I mean, even if they used just a fraction of it for the Sudanese, it would have improved the economy. So the level of corruption, I'm just thinking, it must be really, high.
What was the moment for you when those first economic or half economic motivations for protests turned into fully political ones?
I mean, so it's obviously a lot of people know that it started in Adbara, this provincial town sort of northeast of Khartoum. But even before that, people were burning tires on main roads in Khartoum. But I think the 25th of December...
Well, the 19th of December was chosen as a date to start mass demos because it coincided with the date when Sudan announced independence from Egypt. And so therefore, the professional association had marked that demonstrations would start on the 19th. And I was in Khartoum, actually. I had arrived the day before, and I wasn't in the area of the souk where there are the large demonstrations, but I remember being on Street 60, Shara 60, and the fact that there were demonstrators there, and people were, suddenly you feel that there was a determination, because standing with placards, or whether they were in marches, but the fact that the people were participating. And if we look at this, I think, protests compared to 2013.
The last big outburst
Yeah,
of protests.
the last big protests where almost 200 were killed. It happened over 3 days, but I think people have learned from that. I think the strategy was different, that the protests would start in neighborhoods. So it wasn't particularly to congregate
Jackson Square or wherever.
wherever people would, traditionally go to the center of the city. But this time, the idea was that each neighborhood will start and have a protest. And the idea was that when you're trying to put out a protest that's happening in different neighborhoods, you're actually exhausting the security and distracting them because they don't really know where to focus. Where will they try to put out the fire, as it were. So I think there was a lot of thinking this time and planning into how to make it successful.
What do you think Omar Bashir and his lieutenants were thinking at this point? Because as you say, in September 2013, in just a few days, almost 200 people were killed. It was stamped out very, very quickly. Yeah. And a lot of people expected something quite similar this time, and it didn't happen. Why?
I actually think that the moment that it landed for me personally wasn't the 19th, it was the 25th of December. So it was the day that this huge march in the center of Khartoum took place. And you could see the numbers, like you could not deny how many people were there. And I think that was the moment that the regime were like, oh crap, we're in trouble, this is serious. And people don't care that we're stationed everywhere. People don't seem to be frightened. And that was a day where a lot of people were shot by snipers. Like they were fully deployed on high alert. And it's still on the 31st, again, people plan to go out. It was these big marches that really made it clear that this was organized and it wasn't going away.
And that's in the capital, and these things were also happening in Gedaref.
All in unison,
all over the country,
in different cities.
Talk a little bit about in those months, if you would, Othaylat, about the role the Sudanese Professionals Association played in bringing together those sort of revolutionary energies into a more organised way.
Well, I think the approach, rather than being top-down, was actually, linear, as it were, and the idea is to start from the local neighborhoods and going up, and at the beginning it wasn't even clear who is in the professional association. Should they come out? Should they, announce who they are? Because there was a real danger, obviously, to them.
And the first one who did, Mohammed Hashim, was then arrested for 3 months or something like that.
They had to do it undercover, and it was sort of gradual linking in of everyone, and I think this is what made it very successful.
Not just that organisation, but also social media, the presence of young people, social media as a mobilising force as well, the presence of so many women, which perhaps would not have been a surprise to Sudanese people, but was, I think, a surprise to other people around the world, Yousra.
I think it was still a surprise to Sudanese people. I know female activists who've been going out since 2009 who were like, we've never seen so many women come out with us. And I think, like you said, it wasn't top down, but it was actually people looked to the streets. The SPA and the Sudanese Professionals Association took their call from the streets and they helped them organize. But it was really the young people, and I think women played the biggest role. And then the Sudanese professionals sort of helped them organize, and it was a diaspora effort. So it was professionals all over the diaspora as well as in Sudan, trying to harness this street power and try and give people a goal and give people sort of incentive. But with the women, it was insane, and I think the discourse around that was initially surprise, and then I remember there being comments like, they're coming to cheer us on, and then realizing very quickly, they're not your cheerleaders, mate, they're here to fight the fight. So I think the protests themselves challenged so many things within the Sudanese consciousness, like so many things that people took for granted or didn't understand.
We'll come on to a little bit as to whether the role of women in the process has been replicated in negotiations.
I think for someone of an older generation,
please.
I think I am used to having I remember my mother being an activist. So for me, it was, when you have the 60s, the 70s, the women were very active. To me, it is not at all surprising. To me, it's perhaps during the 30 years of Bashir rule, something happened, but I grew up with this idea of perceiving women as equal in terms of their activism, in terms of professionals and so on.
I think the street did become an increasingly dangerous and hostile place for women during Bashir's regime, so it made it more difficult for women to feel comfortable in a public space. So a lot of female activists said that women would go and then they would realize there wouldn't be sexual harassment during the protests, the initial protests, so they would be like, you know what, come with me next time. And they would tell their friends or the girls in the neighborhood, and then it kept just sort of increasing.
Mohanad Hashim for the BBC has just joined us, fresh from work, I think. This is on tape, so that's everyone around the world saluting your late arrival. Mohanad, perhaps you could tell us a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the sit-in. We've talked about the early days of the protest. Just bring us up to April the 11th. How was Omar al-Bashir overthrown?
April the 11th. April the 11th was that moment of shock that a lot of Sudanese, if it's fair to say, because of all the politics that happened after the 11th of April and the stalling of this whole transitional process and all the blood that has come, many people still haven't fathomed the fact that Omar al-Bashir is not in power, that Omar al-Bashir is in jail, and for that matter, we're yet to see where Bashir is in jail. That's regarding to the key, the major issue. How did the 11th fall,
So we talked a bit about gathering protests around the country. Yeah. I guess the next point would be April the 6th.
April the 6th, yes. This was the strange one, because it's very unusual. I was 9 years old in April 1985 when Ja'far Nimeri was ousted on the 6th of April. So to think that within 34 years, people are going to say, whoa, there's an anniversary. Let's mark it. Let's turn out in the street. And that was basically, I don't know, I came in when you're talking about young people and women and the role of women in all of this. But I was one of the people who constantly, while saluting the young generation that has done what we couldn't do and the generation before us couldn't do, this young generation didn't come out of a vacuum. And that continuity of the generations and the simple fact that you have a country that's still in the shape of, for example, the head of the Sudanese Communist Party is an octogenarian. He was there in 1956 when we got independence from Britain. He was there in 1964, our first uprising, 1985. He's actually witnessed 3 revolutions. Now that is unusual by many standards. And the fact that he's sitting on the negotiations table and he's championing a lot of what the young people are asking for, I think that continuity is what thrust the 6th of April. And that continuity is what was in play this Sunday, when a month in the 21st century, people are without an internet. Oh, they're not going to turn out. People are scared. They've been shot. They've been killed. No, they were meeting in mosques, in shops, in buses, in minivans, in tuk-tuk spots, in corner spots, in football stadiums, in wakes, because still it's a country that's reeling from some serious violence. That what happened to Khartoum. Khartoum hasn't experienced that kind of violence since the mid-70s, I believe.
It's analog. It went analog suddenly.
And analog is the way, you know, like, and it went so analog that then Wyclef Jean sort of like in that weekend puts out a song, how analog do you want to go, you know?
So April the 6th, big protests outside, this sit-in outside military headquarters. April the 11th, some of his closest associates overthrow Omar al-Bashir. Who then are the people on the Transitional Military Council? We talked a little bit about Hemedti. You've done quite a lot of work. You've made a big program about him. Who are the main figures running Sudan right now?
I would say just Hemedti, basically. I think everyone else has sort of taken a back seat. He's the man with the money. He's the man with the troops. He's the man with the regional, usefulness, I would say. And everyone has taken his lead, whether or not they wanted to, on the Transitional Military Council. I mean, I think it came up a few months ago that Burhan couldn't, or a few weeks ago, that Burhan could not control him at all.
Burhan being his nominal
Burhan
leader.
being the actual head of the Transitional Military Council as opposed to the vice chair. So I think the dynamics have definitely made, have been very clear over the last 2 months who's in charge, and it's a terrifying reality.
Terrifying why?
Because, as I said earlier, and I will happily say again, Hemedti is a war criminal. And I think it's been proven time and time again. In Darfur, in South Kordofan, in Blue Nile State, he is the regime's rebellion crusher. And for Bashir's attack dog to become basically the de facto ruler of Sudan is terrifying.
But where does this power come from, in the sense that he has 40, 50,000 troops, whatever it is? Sudanese armed forces are much bigger. Sudanese armed forces have planes, have tanks, in theory, greater resources.
I think the problem is that actually what's becoming evident now is that the Sudanese army has been weakened to the extent, yes, that now, someone who was until recently a militia leader, until he was sort of amalgamated into the national army, is actually stronger. And so it just exposes the extent of, how weak the national army had become, because as a policy to sort of neutralize the army so that there wouldn't be someone who would overthrow Bashir. And he was relying on militias to stay in power.
And not just weak, the armed forces, but also divided. Some still Islamists, some less. No one perhaps in the army knows what his fellow officers are thinking, whereas Hemedti is pretty sure that if he says go, his troops will follow.
Yeah, he has autonomy to some degree because his troops pledge allegiance only to him. So he has consolidated power. But also, when you look at the Transitional Military Council, some of the most respected generals, like Burhan is very much a loved army general. He's leading the Transitional Military Council. Yasser Atta, another loved general. He's got a role in the political council of the Transitional Military Council. So the army has not only been neutralized, but all of their leaders are a part of this body that is in Hemedti's control.
So why then do you think they took the decision in the early hours of June the 3rd to disperse so violently this protest? Hemedti, you believe, took this decision?
I think that actually the plan could have been Ghosh's plan.
Salah Ghosh.
Salah Ghosh was, previously head of security, deposed, came back. It was leaked that he had the plan. He thought that, okay, if you're going to kill 200 people, then that's going to scare them, and they're, and people would
like
stop.
in 2013.
No, just recently, even before.
I'm saying that.
Yeah,
like
like in 2013. I think, I think that Bashir and those who were in power seriously just lost complete touch with reality, and could not understand.
The reason why I say that
could
is
not understand the power of because coming up from the people, and so the way that the sit-in was dispersed so brutally. I mean, they could have done, they could have announced, for example, that, we want to disband the sit-in, give it a date, give it time, use loudspeakers, whatever. But it was done deliberately at dawn when people were sleeping. There were no safe corridors for them to escape, and it was shoot to kill. It was deliberate plan, and the army were standing by, watching.
As the rapid support forces, Hemedti's people carried.
And regime forces, so NES.
So this is a clear strategy. The reason also I think that security are involved is that it is not just the people who were at the sit-in who were killed. There has been targeted assassinations actually, and I think with the targeted assassinations, this needs some form of information, security to know who's who. The people who are being killed in demos are not just random. They're the leaders of
Resistance committees.
neighborhood committees, in the Hay. So to have that kind of information, that means it's intelligence, and so therefore, I think it's the Bashir's intelligence working together with Hemedti. I don't think it's simply Hemedti.
On this idea, I was picking up a little bit on this idea of losing touch with reality. The reason it just occurred to me that massacres on those scales, killing on those scales, are of course shocking and very shocking in Khartoum, but they've been happening in Darfur, in South Sudan. Hemedti will have thought, and maybe others, we've done it elsewhere. We can get away with doing it here.
I actually think that they were a lot more. They actually tried to cover their tracks with the massacre in Khartoum, like throwing the bodies in the Nile. They would never care to do that in Darfur or South Kordofan. There was some element of damage control. They wanted, I think that they were given license to use violence, but they were also told, just be careful, don't make it too obvious, because throwing bodies in the Nile, they would have just left them there if it was anywhere else in the country. So I think there was consciousness about how they would appear in the public eye if this was done as brutally as it was.
Trying to cover their tracks.
Yeah.
If they thought that they'd ended the revolution, last weekend, June 30th, proved them wrong, essentially. The huge protests in different parts of the country. Mohanad, we talked a little bit about the organisation of it, analog and so on, but how do you think that affects the fundamental balance of power between civilians and military?
I mean, I acknowledging all the facts that have been mentioned here, we have to bear in mind that Hemedti is a disruptor to the political system that is the Sudanese political system as it's manifested since the British conquered Sudan in 1899. That, in essence, brought a particular contingency or a constituency of the Sudanese to power. Now today, to have some...
By that you mean the northern elite?
The northern Riverarian, so-called quote-unquote Arabs of Sudan, and the middle classes that came from the British education and so forth, and the people who like Hemedti is fundamentally a disruptor because he's not a graduate of the University of Khartoum, and he's not a staff college graduate. So he doesn't come from the two vehicles that everyone who's ruled the Sudan is a product of.
Except Bashir.
I mean, Bashir is also a staff college. Yeah, they all staff. Hemedti comes from that hinter borderland where he represents the marginalized. There is a constituency that sees in Hemedti and in what he's doing as, some sort of a legitimate process to try and bring development that parts of the country has lacked for. But to come back to your point, there is also there is a dynamic. Yousra, you saw it, we all saw it. The simple fact that you're walking around the sit-in site, day in, day out. You have soldiers on their technicals, mostly young men between the ages of, say, 16, 17 to 20, 21. These are the soldiers. They're sitting in the heat all the time. They're staring at young men and women, their age, who fundamentally disagree with the way these guys view the world. These guys view the world through the barrel of a gun. These guys are viewing the world through connectivity, through song, through music, and everything to them comes with a smile. Even when they chant and they say, "You're Janjaweed thugs," they're doing it with a smile. Yes, those loudspeakers were blasting day in, day out, all the time. These are men, young men, not educated, from very poor backgrounds, and they're coming from the edges of the desert in Sudan. I mean, and these are people who are coming from the edges of Darfur or whatever. Hemedti's RSF, and it's where he's recruiting from. So for a lot of people who at the tender age of 5 and 6 are taught how to slaughter a lamb, they're given a Kalashnikov at the age of 9 and told to look after a herd of camels on their own in the middle of nowhere. By the time they become 18, 19, and they're brought into the city, they've been sat down in the city, and all they see is city boys and girls are happy to sing and talk about things they don't really understand. And it's this dynamic which was at play on the 3rd of June. It's this dynamic that is at play on the 30th of June. And ultimately, I think it is this dynamic that, Hemedti cannot control his forces. He acknowledged many times, not him, many officers, offline and online, on the record and off the record, that they have a real problem with discipline and disciplining their soldiers. Yes, they will heed the orders to kill or to beat or to do this. But many people I've spoken to last week when I was in Khartoum, they were telling me the same story. We had RSF officers with 2 or 3 stars coming and taking us and walking us. I mean, these RSF officers will be pointing guns at women to walk them through one safety corridor and then tell them run. We cannot control the soldiers. So I think ultimately, if this violence continues, and I don't think the mobilization is going to subside. The people I met, there is too much anger. It's a generational thing, and it's disconnect between the old generals and their soldiers. It's disconnect between the old politicians and the young protesters in the street that ultimately will go its own route. Now, whether these two groups of young people can find a way to accommodate each other without killing each other.
I want to talk about sort of possible futures quite soon, but can we just touch on the international dimension to all this? Gulf countries, Western countries, Transitional Military Council is getting its support largely from Saudi Arabia, Qatar,
Egypt,
UAE.
UAE.
Why?
Egypt,
Why?
UAE, and Saudi. Well, obviously because of the involvement of Sudan in the war in Yemen, and now with the UAE saying that they're going to cut back their forces, unfortunately, it means that possibly Sudan is going to be called upon to to step up. And
But that's a choice, isn't it? Sudanese leaders can decide whether they send troops to Yemen or not.
But, well, unfortunately, yeah, of course. But this is, it was a deal struck by Bashir that in return for financial support that they will send troops to Yemen. And it's sort of like, obviously, if there is a new government, they will have they can reconsider on that. But at the moment, this is the choice that's been made and stuck by.
I don't think.
And for Hemedti, I mean, also considering that the troops in Yemen are Hemedti's, RSF. So I don't foresee that changing unless there's going to be change overall in the structure.
Ultimately, that deal benefited not Bashir, but Hemedti. It
Hemedti
created
And
directly.
Burhan. So Burhan, the TMC head, was involved. He was Inspector General. Him and Hemedti actually worked together to recruit in that forward. But I think what people don't remember is that these young guys that are being sent to Yemen are getting paid a lot of money, and their families really benefit from this money. So I spoke to people that said, in Darfur, it's a scramble to try and get sent to Yemen. People want to get sent to Yemen.
But sadly enough, I consider it peanuts. It's considered a lot of money for them, but $1,000 is not a lot of money.
To risk your life.
We are really
but they're
literally,
the ones
they are the ones who, in their eyes, $1,000 is something. But I think for me, a human being is worth more than $1,000.
With the poverty that is in Sudan, this is the real problem that to Hemedti's benefit and advantage, it will play out at least in the short term. It's the simple fact that he has this abundance to cash, and a recruitment drive is going through the roof. People are signing up, and you sit down and you speak to an average army soldier who's getting something like $100, and he's comparing his $100 to the $800 that someone who's half his age is getting by virtue of signing up to the Rapid Support Force. But then we keep on talking about the real bad guys in this, and we point the finger towards the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Naturally, they're Middle Eastern. They are the counter-revolution. They are in the international psyche for backing X and Y projects in Syria, in Libya, or in Yemen. But the reality is, Hemedti is meeting with the Sayasa Forgi, is meeting with Idris Deby in Chad. Even in Ethiopia, even in Uganda, in the neighborhood where we're in, the type of democratic change that the young people in Sudan want to bring will always be. Will always has its detractors, not forgetting the spoilers at home.
I wonder if someone would want to take on the argument that the European Union, through the Khartoum process, emboldened, reinforced Hemedti's power.
Yeah. So, don't get me started on the EU's role in this.
Please.
No, I'm gonna. Don't worry. So the EU with this deal or this process, the Khartoum process, wanted to stop migration to Europe by empowering regimes in North Africa.
To stop the migrants at source.
To stop the migrants, when obviously you're creating more migrants by empowering such regimes. But the Horn of Africa Trust, the money was sent to government agencies, NGOs, and some government agencies, and the money, if you try and find documents to find out how this money got to the RSF, you won't. And people who work with the EU have told me that it was by design. There was intentionally no paper trail. The money was sent to combat migration. It ended up in the hands of the RSF. But also, journalists that ended up in front of Hemedti, like Phil Cox, told me that he was very aware of the role that he had to play for the EU. He said to him, the EU is very important to us, but also these RSF soldiers who have no real knowledge of bureaucratic entities like the EU were like, yeah, the EU, yeah, we know them. There was definitely an awareness on the ground that this money reached the border control.
So those sort of Western ambassadors saying, no, we didn't help them at all, you don't believe them?
I don't believe it. One, because firstly, the RSF is the official border guard in Sudan. So you can't throw money at border control and be surprised that it ends up with the official border guard. Two, confidential documents that Der Spiegel got a hold of back in 2016 from the first meetings that the EU had, the secret meeting the EU had about the Horn of Africa Trust, about the Khartoum process. When you look at the minutes, they were very aware of the reputational risk of engaging with the regimes. Specifically, Sudan is mentioned by Italy. No one can know about this, was what they said. They knew what they were doing, and the initial plan was on paper to train the border force, but from what I've gathered from sources, the training never happened because they knew of the reputational risk, but the money did end up with the RSF.
I mean, two things to add to this. I don't believe or disbelieve, but from what I understand, and it's going back to that 2016 moment, is that there was two figures touted, 135 million and 220 million. Now, what actually of that sum went to Sudan, some would suggest between 5 and 10. That was the total that went to Sudan. Another point is to what extent were this agreement or that part of the Khartoum process was done on bilateral process. So while we're all running to the EU, say, what have you done? I think we need to be going to the Foreign Office in London, to the French Foreign Ministry, to the Italian Foreign Ministry, to the German Foreign Ministry. These are the entities that were in charge of disposing that cash. So it's not the EU, because I mean, at the moment in England, anything bashing the EU could be good in the media, but put the EU aside and all that Brexit debate on top of it. But I think the EU has not been transparent and they have not been forthcoming with it. And it's only because there is this confusion, whether is it a supra-institutional project, or is this something done on an individual basis?
I mean, I interviewed an MP who is a part of the all-parliamentary group that has been to Sudan, and his argument was that basically oil money is coming in, you don't know which money is which, you don't know what's going on, but the real question is, why was there not more transparency with the Khartoum process? You expect more transparency with deals like this, especially when they are engaging with countries like Sudan. And again, you cannot throw money at border control in a country like Sudan and be shocked that it has reached the hands of the RSF. I
know plenty of people have questions, and we can perhaps get back to that in the questions. I just wanted to end this discussion segment by getting a sense from you how you feel the negotiations now are going. Direct talks just resumed on Wednesday, and where, big question, this is all heading. Are we going to have a civilian government? Are we going to have a fallout between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces and conflict in Khartoum? Are we going to have ongoing military war? Where do you think this is going? Starting perhaps with you've been following the negotiations quite closely.
Well, it goes up and down, and we had the first face-to-face negotiations yesterday, which was surprising, of course, given after the events of June 3rd and June 30th. But the noise is coming out is that it's positive, that although it goes back and forth, that is it, the agreements regarding the power sharing between the Transitional Military Council and the forces of
Freedom and
Change. And the main sticking points, of course, is about the ratios. Is it 7-7 plus 1 civilian? Is it 5-5 plus 1? The latest now we're told is 8 military, 8 civilians plus 1 extra civilian, so it's not clear.
This is on a sovereign council.
On the Sovereign Council,
above the other bodies.
they've agreed a 3-year interim period before elections are held, so this is somewhat positive. The sticking point, of course, is whether there'll be an international investigation into the massacre that happened, because this is one of the preconditions for the FFC. And the other sticking point is about the presidency. And it goes from one moment of, oh, there's been a breakthrough, to, oh, no, we're back to square one.
And the fundamental question there is, are the military guys prepared to hand over power?
And that's another thing, yeah.
I mean, no, please.
I don't think that the military is planning to hand power. I think that realistically we'll find a way to fudge a transitional period until we get an elections. But between here and the elections, there's going to be a lot of drama. And the last thing I heard regarding these talks that are going on today, that when I was coming, Hemedti wants to be the leader of the Sovereign Council for the first year and a half.
Because it's meant to be rotating, isn't it?
It's meant to be rotating, absolutely.
The FFC wanted to be rotating.
Yeah, well, it's important to remember that Hemedti is in the negotiation room for the first time with the opposition. I wonder why, guys. Seriously. But another thing to remember is the fact that an agreement was drafted on June 3rd that was meant to be signed in the evening of June 3rd, and the massacre still happened. So unless I see this document signed in front of me, I really would not
The
bet
massacre
my life on
still
it.
happened, or the massacre happened because the deal was close and people didn't want a deal?
Well, that's
Yeah,
what
but it
people...
wasn't. Sorry, it's not the protesters who
No, as in
committed
the
as in
dispersal.
the dispersal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. Okay. Yeah.
So until a deal is signed, I don't think anyone will know. Hemedti has been garnering local support, rallying, doing popular rallies, negotiating with tribal leaders, getting loads of tribal leaders on board. It's clear that he wants to be president, at least either during the transitional period or creating an environment where early elections happen so that he can run for presidency. So it's in Hemedti's interest for these talks to fall through so that he can try and get elections in 9 months, or that he can negotiate presidency. But I think either way, he feels like the optics are good if he's in the room and try and fight his corner.
And Yousra, on the streets, in the protests, lots of women at the negotiating table.
Zero women. And that was something that I spoke to women who were signees to the Declaration of Freedom of Change, so technically should be involved in the negotiation process. They felt like they were constantly battling with the opposition to even get in the room, which was really hurtful to them, because they felt like we bear the brunt of the violence on the streets. We're the ones being sexually harassed and systemically targeted by the regime forces. We deserve to not only fight the fight in the streets, but fight in the room as well for our rights. So there's a complete disconnect between the negotiations room and the streets. And I think that's why you'll see now increasingly more backlash at the FFC. People feel like the opposition aren't being hard enough, they're not being inclusive enough. So I think they've got a big job on their hands.
And they did the same mistake again when they went into negotiations yesterday. I mean, these complaints were there from the beginning of the sit-in, from when you were there, and there were women carrying marshes about why are we not represented. And you can rest assured that the fact that we don't have any women on the table means we're going to have another bloodbath or fight or something on our hands. It's not going to go well.
So some limits perhaps to the transformation we've been talking about earlier. I'm sure plenty of people have got questions, got a hand up already, so just for enthusiasm alone, perhaps we'll go to you. Could I just ask, though, for questions rather than comments, keep it brief, because lots of people will want to talk.
Thank you very much.
And sorry, if you could just introduce yourself and any affiliation as well, please.
The name's Ewan Grant. I'm the former UK Customs Service intelligence analyst for the ex-Soviet states. I subsequently worked for a European Commission program with the border guards in Ukraine and the State Security Service in Ukraine. And I can assure you they would very definitely endorse this lady's comments about how the EU does not get stuff like the Khartoum process right. They can't the EU cannot handle the deep state. It's of course different for the member states. My question is, given that Sudan is negotiating Hemedti with several deep states, such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia, is there any chance that the wider international community can come in to perhaps get some long-standing fudge of leaving the generals and Hemedti with their riches and their support for the war in Sudan, in Yemen, but in return for further aid, carefully targeted, which is dependent on a largely civilian government and fairly free elections? I think that's quite a hard call, but it may be I'd be interested in what you think.
Thank you. Should we take a couple more and do 2 or 3 at once, gentlemen here? Just wait for the microphone and introduce yourself, if you would.
My name is Tariq Mohammed. I'm the president of SBBC, Sudan British Business Council. This was registered on the 7th of Feb. And the question is really centering around the economy. The reason for the revolution, pre-revolution, is the economy. The reason for the problems at the moment is people wanting to safeguard their winnings from the previous corrupt economy. And going forward, the solutions will also be in the economy, because the Sudanese who actually have taken power, and I think power is actually taken, not given, because the age of Suwar al-Dahab, gentlemen who can give up power, is already gone. It's never to come back again. So the power has already been taken by people in the street. The question is, how quickly can we move the narrative to the economy?
Thank you very much. Perhaps one more.
My name's Ali Blail. I'm a television producer, but a student currently in SOAS. I have really 2 questions. Yousra described the atmosphere in the sit-ins, and I live in Egypt, and it's strikingly similar to Tahrir, what happened in Tahrir. However, Sudan, we run the risk of making it similar to Egypt, whereas like Mohanad, Sudan has a longer history. In 64, there was a civil uprising, 85, and there is a somewhat coherent political guiding force behind all this, which didn't happen in Egypt. That's, if you could shed light on that political impact on the protest, or how it interacted. The other question is a bit rather naive. How is this different than 64 and 85? Why were 64 and 85 so neat compared to this one? And I'm alluding to what happens when an Islamist regime comes to power and what they do.
Great, thank you. We'll have time for more questions later, of course. Let's start with those 3, perhaps. All right. Can the international community bring about a long-standing fudge? We set our sights rather low, I think, probably for an outcome. But what role can the international community at this stage bring to bear, Mohanad?
That's a difficult question, because for one, I don't think there is an international community that has a will that can bear on the Sudan. Number 2, Hemedti has learned from Omar al-Bashir, the oldest survivor in the bloc, on how to survive without any international backing. Hemedti, as I say, as far as regional arrangements are concerned, I know there is an Ethiopian mediation initiative going, which is backed by the African Union, and that has the support of the Troika, Britain, the US, and Norway, and subsequently the European Union. Missing are the Chinese And the Russians. The Russians are spearheading an effort into the CAR. They have a base in southern Darfur. They are involved in providing training for Hemedti. Equally,
Gold mining.
And the gold mining and the uranium and all this stuff, that stuff aside. For Wagner and their presence in Khartoum, it's endless. Haftar is a strong man in Libya, and he's currently seeking support from Hemedti in his military operations. That might materialize by the end of August. We might see Sudanese troops from the Rapid Support Force fighting with Haftar. Idris Deby.
Sudanese rebel groups have fought in Libya
Yeah,
for
Sudanese.
years, for example.
And Idris Deby, Hemedti was in Chad, and he got to talk to the JEM and the SLM Minawi. So there is an attempt to address a constituency that has serious grievances in Darfur, and with the Chadians on board. And in Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed has, the Sudanese curse has caught up with him. He was last week willing to be meeting the Sudanese interlocutors, both sides. He had his chief of staff assassinated, and for now, Ethiopia is busy with a domestic agenda. And we have a UAE that is very, very versatile, let's say, although they're drawing down their troops from Yemen. And just one thing to remember, that why there is no international community. How long did it take us here in Britain to stop sales to the Saudis when we know that they're clearly bombing Yemenis? To put it into perspective, last week Hemedti was addressing a constituency, and he said it out there in the open. I am the coalition on the ground in Yemen. So the fact that there are 30,000 Sudanese soldiers who are bearing the brunt of the battles in Yemen, I don't think, the Saudis better tread carefully, because if they mess around with this guy, we don't know.
To Tariq's question now on how quickly can we pivot to the economy, Yousra, would you like to?
I think that, first, maybe not have over $1 billion in losses by cutting out the internet. That would be a good start. I think it will be really difficult to focus on the economy when the political climate is so volatile and unstable. But I think that there could be some safeguards in place that clearly there's a complete disregard to the economy right now. And the lines for fuel are still ongoing. The Transitional Military Council has had huge deposits of money from the UAE and from Saudi, and that money is not being seen on the ground. I don't think they want to focus on the economy right now, because it will show that they are incapable of salvaging the economy. But also, I just think it's a bit maybe too soon to even try and think about that when people are being shot in the street.
On the question from here about how different from 64 and 85, and also perhaps sort of any guiding political thought behind
I think,
the current.
for me, what was unique about this uprising is the fact that it wasn't at all, apart from the Sudanese Professional Association, the main traditional political parties were not really involved. It's not, so it wasn't party-led at all, that it's a pure grassroots movement. And I think if there's one thing that makes me optimistic about the future, it is this. And actually, ironically enough, we're having the traditional parties coming in and wanting to claim a stake in the government or the new order that they didn't really bring, because they somehow feel that they're entitled to it. So I think this is a big difference. And you're saying, why is it less neat, or what was your question, Ali?
Yeah, it's not as neat as 64 or 85.
Well,
why
I think.
Isn't the army, I know it's naive, why isn't the army handing power in
Yeah, but what we, if you, following from the discussion is the fact that, first of all, the army is not as unified. There are reports, by the way, that there are purges within the army. We don't know what's happening. I mean, the civilian deaths are apparent. We don't really know what's happening within the army. And the fact that, apart from the RSF, you have several other parallel militias who were in power. So it's to realize that you don't have a national army actually is quite
And that
something.
division of security forces was a way Omar Bashir stayed in power, but
Stayed
it
in
also makes
power,
it
yeah.
more complicated now
Yeah.
for any one faction to give way, I suppose. Let's get some more questions. Yes, one here, please.
Thank you very much. So my name is Marwa. I am a GP and I'm a member of the Sudan Doctors Union, which is one of the bodies member of the SPA. I would like to ask a question about Darfur and other I would say marginalized areas. We see them mentioned as a places where the atrocities happened, and people always say, oh, actually this has been happening in Darfur for so many times, but the root cause of why this happened and the issues of the margin hasn't been, the discussion is not open yet about it in terms of within this revolution. So I would like to ask, what would be the way to shift the narrative for the people to talk about the issues of the margin, because I see them as a root cause for the political instability in Sudan for many, many decades. They are the reason why this government was weakened, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of a lot of spending directed to the military, as well as, of course, the separation of South Sudan. So unless this is being addressed from the root cause, I think we will be in this turmoil forever. So how can we shift and put the narrative of the margin in the forefront of this revolution? Thank you.
Thank you. Hand at the back there. Just wait for the microphone if you would, and introduce yourself.
My name is Iman Baldo. I am an independent researcher. The gentleman who posed the question about the will of the international community, just to take the audience back, we are talking about this kind of present crisis as if there is no precursor. Had the international community had the will, because they had the resources and all the might, to actually have a comprehensive peace for Sudan in 2004, we wouldn't have been in this current predicament. The international community is actually party to this kind of configuration we are seeing now. And to talk about the protest and the sit-in and how this glorious world where everything in Sudan has been changed, and the women interaction and all the street children who have had a refuge and all the kind of might, it was not dispersed overnight. It was not arrayed at dawn. If you remember the novel by Garcia Marquez, A Chronicle of a Death Foretold, this is the depiction of the situation at the sit-in. Everybody knew what is going to happen. Everybody knew that it is going to happen. The world was watching, and it happened. The Vicario brothers killed Santiago Santiago Nassar, and everybody knew, and they didn't tell anybody. This is the situation we are now. And if the Channel 4, the question is, if Channel 4 has brought us this hope, we have been over the moon that now in the audience, in the Western democracies, we have somebody to influence policy. Is there any experience, the Western media, CNN and James Elbagir and this, the gentleman from BBC and Yousra, all this, have you had an evaluation to tell us what are the experiences that we actually have learned, and whether there is something we can take further from here in order just to help a weak country get out of that, and in our lifetime see some kind of hope for the marginalized and non-marginalized? Thank you.
Thank you. One more perhaps, yeah. Quickest hand here, the lady here, yeah, just microphone coming your way.
Hi, my name is Hilaria. My name is Yousra Elbagir, and I'm a senior researcher for Human Rights Watch on Central Africa. I was curious to understand from you to which extent you think this uprising in Sudan has the potential to influence neighboring civil society, and whether there are or there have been any contacts between the activists in Sudan and other human rights defenders and activists or civil society members in other neighboring countries, including, for example, Cameroon.
Thank you very much. Should we start with the issue of marginalisation and how that can be moved central to the narrative? Who wants to?
I mean, I think it would start with there being more inclusivity within the opposition, which is something I posed to Mohammed Hashim, and he said that the Forces of Freedom of Change did have inclusivity from Darfur, but once again, we go to the negotiation room and all you see is men from Khartoum. So I think that the dialogue needs to change within the negotiation process for there to at least be a gesture that the voices from, Darfur, from South Kordofan, from Blue Nile State will be not only heard, but these demands will be implemented.
On paper, that's there, right? I mean, if you look at the FFC document, it's talking about solving the wars, it's talking about ending marginalisation.
There's a disconnect, and that's the same with the women not being in the room. But when I interviewed the men who came from Niala to join the sit-in, they said, our demands are different, our needs are different, and as long as we're not here, they won't be echoed or expressed. And you expect it from the regime, but when you see it from the opposition, it's quite disheartening to see that sort of exclusivity.
Yeah, but I don't think the fact that they're not there at the negotiating table necessarily means that they're not thought about, because I think the Sudan that we dream of, the Sudan that we think about, is a Sudan of diversity and where there will be equality for the different regions. And I think people are still reeling from the fact that the South is independent, and definitely regional cohesion is something that the Sudanese think and dream about. I think the whole thing about the Maidan is that it was a utopia in a way of the kind of society that we would like to have.
I
or
disagree.
Is that too idealistic?
I think I disagree, because I think if the voices aren't in the room, then it's not coming from the people. It's a reiteration, or they're speaking on behalf of the people. So I think it would have been good to have a man from Darfur, a woman from, South Kordofan. It might be optimistic now, but I think that from the very start of the negotiation process, we didn't see a single one of those voices in the room, and I think that that's not a good sign.
Yeah, I mean, while I agree with you that the simple absence of considerable sectors, women or people who represent the marginalized areas from that negotiating room could be a problem, it's a structural problem, I think, to an extent, Marwa, if I'm not mistaken. It's the simple fact that you have, for example, when it comes to Darfur, you have the armed groups, whether it's JEM or the SLM, they are signatories to the Sudan call, which then allows them to negotiate with the military on its separate terms, to the terms that the military is willing to bring to the table to the civilians. And I say it's a structural problem because historically, the military in Sudan likes to divide up people and to speak to them individually and so forth. Then there was the whole issue when the SPLM North were invited to go and talk in Abu Dhabi, but then the minute Yasser Arman declared unilaterally that he'd like to go to Khartoum to take part in the talks, what happened? He got arrested, and then he got deported. And then now we follow on, and then we see, for example, Minawi is happy to meet in Chad separately with nobody else in the room. And meanwhile, Abdel Wahid, for example, is sitting in Paris. He's happy to speak to us on social media, but he's not willing to even entertain the idea to meet. So I think this is a problem. It's the structure of the nature of the armed movements and the nature of how Khartoum has historically wanted to do talks by dividing up the opposition.
And also perhaps an issue that the marginalised end up being represented only by people who have guns, which might not be the only voices from those areas.
But there are plenty of I met at the sit-in, students from Darfur, really ambitious young students who had come to raise awareness, to speak about what they wanted to do, and I just felt like
South Sudanese too, actually.
It felt like they could only speak on a street level, and then be represented.
But
by
I think
rebel
that speaking on the street level, that was in and around the sit-in side, the simple fact that, for example, imagine this: you're a military. No military in the world will allow the area around it to be occupied, let alone like the Sudanese armed forces. And you coming into the entrance of the Ministry of Defense, the people who will order the Antonov to go and bomb in Southern Kordofan, in Blue Nile, in Darfur, in front of them, there is a huge wall with all the names of the people who are prisoners for the SLM Minawi, the SLM Abdel Wahid, graphic images of the victims and so forth. And
people talking about markers,
people talking about it from all walks of life. And on any given day, if you had gone to for example, the Wadi Hawar tent, on any given day, there is a survivor of some sort of an atrocity that is educating people who could have never imagined the sort of things these people were sharing. The simple fact that you had your average urban Khartoumis from whatever class, from the wealthiest to the most poor, had the opportunity to go for a stroll and stand and talk and engage in a thing where you tell them, no, this didn't happen. And then people will swear to you, no, this did happen. And how heated and passionate those discussions were. I think that was one of the greatest advantages of the fact that we had a 7-week sit-in in a city like Khartoum for it to sort of like deal with its living in denial for 15 years or 20 years.
I sense we can talk quite a lot more about that, but let's get on perhaps to the next question. Lessons learned, Channel 4, BBC.
All I can say is that next week, or actually, yeah, the 7th will be the anniversary of Srebrenica. I remember we were all there watching, knew what was going to happen, and it happened. Unfortunately, so it's not only Sudan. I remember the war in Bosnia. We all knew. We're all watching, so I don't know whether, but it's a question of international will, but I don't know whether it's a question of absence of media.
I think that it's the media's role is to reflect. So I think it's important that the realities on the ground are reflected, and then these countries can't plead ignorance or act like they don't know what's going on in Sudan. So I think our job as journalists is to try and reflect as much as possible from as many groups as possible from Sudan, not just the people in Khartoum, but the TMC banned us from going to Darfur, actually, just in case you guys wanted to know. So Mohanad and I both had trips to Darfur. We were told not to go to Darfur. There's a reason for that, because they don't want people to see what's going on in Darfur, because once again people will be moved to act. Whether they do act is another issue, and that is the role of advocacy groups and activists to try and mobilize people. But I think as journalists, our job is to educate and inform.
And on that question of activism, is it spreading from Sudan to neighbouring countries? Are people getting an inspiration from what happened in Sudan? Happening?
I think yes. I've spoken to people who had been contacted from as far west as Venezuela and as far east as Hong Kong. So are we talking to the world and to people in the region? There are stands taking place in Cameroon. There are people in Kampala or in Nairobi who are showing solidarity, in Ghana, in South Africa, in Algeria. So I think the fact that we've managed to keep it for 7 months, or the Sudanese people are braving it for 7 months, and they know they're going to face a militia or a regime or gangs that don't care. I mean, they're shooting at them with bullets the length of this cup. I mean, a bullet like this comes in, it obliterates your leg, and you're left not being able to walk for the rest of your life. Yet people are still stupidly or courageously willing to stare them, open bare chests, and say, "Go on. What are you going to do? Are you going to fire?" So I mean, I think that is there, and there are more and more experiences to be learned. And of course, the nature of revolutionary times. Do we have revolutionary enough leaders with the vision and the commitment to shoulder the responsibility that this generation of young people is putting into them?
Questions?
Sorry.
Thank you. I'll try and make it quick. Question is, what do you think it's going to take to have the kind of cultural shift that we need in how we conceive of power in Sudan? That it doesn't have to come at the end of a gun, that it doesn't have to come from old, octogenarian men from the, Khartoum University, etc. And to actually to translate that kind of atmosphere that you recognize, that you acknowledge was at the sit-in, and have that within the transition period actually become something. So looking forward to however the transitional period may look like, as Mohanad said, it may not look like how we want it to. But how do we use that time, whether it's 9 months, 3 years, or 4, to build up that level of momentum, I suppose, and also keep up the momentum, but also build up actual concrete, tangible ways in which the youth, women, etc., can be at the center of discussions? Because I disagree with you respectfully, Othaylat. I don't think, just because you're not there, it doesn't mean that your voice isn't heard. You have to be there. Otherwise, your voice is definitely not heard. That's where the decisions are made. We learned that with the CPA. You don't have a gun, you don't get heard. you know, you don't get your point of view rubber stamped by the international community if you don't have a gun. That's a terrible lesson to learn. How can we undo that during the transition period?
Thank you. This gentleman here has been waiting for a while.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for attending. But special thanks to Yousra. I just want to thank the fact that you guys have clearly reflected the perfect storm trifecta of factors that came into effect that led to the uprising. Things like Brexit, the refugee crisis, and in the EU, whether it's real or in the media, the rise of Trump and fascism again in Europe, and also regionally the failure of the CPA and the escalation of the civil war in South Sudan all caused the certain elements of the international community to take notice and think of a different direction to that of what we've seen in Egypt. My question really to all three of you is, how do you see the role of MBS, MBZ, and Hemedti in their plan for a Arab NATO? Thank you.
Thank you. I have one pointed question and then one more theoretical one. The first is around the role of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamiyin, and where that's going to sort of go in the next phase of whatever Sudan looks like. Because Al-Islamiyin have had a significant cultural change. The Sudan of today is not the Sudan of the 70s and 80s that my parents knew, and that many, I think, in this room know. And the culture has genuinely changed, and the role of Saudi in the region and so on is quite steep. So what does that mean for what Sudan will look like in the future? And I guess the second one is a bit more philosophical, which is Sudan is a British construct, is it not? Do we need to think about a different way of what governance looks like in North Africa? Because I'm not sure, I guess I'm not sure that that this construct that we're fighting for is even the right one, but perhaps I'm too far away for that to be a real relevant question.
No, all relevant, I think. Well, let's start with the, how can a cultural shift be brought about during a transitional period? And I suppose one of the key things is that going to be 9 months, 3 years, 4 years? That obviously plays a big role in that. But how do you actually translate some of those ideas into reality?
I think the reason the sit-in was dispersed was because it was so dangerous to the deep state. I mean, you would go in every corner, like I said, there was these sort of awareness campaigns, these people sort of speaking, being like, you know what, I'm a law professor. Let me tell you all the ways that this regime has violated international humanitarian law. Another woman being like, I'm a journalist. This is what Hemedti has done in these regions in Sudan. That's why it became such a point of contention, I think. It wasn't just people were gathering, it's that people were informing themselves and they were educating themselves, and it was on a very sort of grassroots level. It wasn't sort of I'm better than you. It's no, we're all in this together. How can we do better? I think that as Mohanad saw, needs to continue in neighborhoods. It needs, the face-to-face mobilization is so impactful, and I think that as long as this power struggle continues, that will continue to take place.
Although it was easier when there was a physical site, and also that was only Khartoum.
And also social media was ongoing. You have people that have now become quite sort of celebrated commentators from the diaspora talking about things, and you can follow this one or you can not like that one and follow the other one. Also, with social media, a lot of the people abroad who are amplifying what's happening on the ground are women, for example. So, I mean, I think that challenges any sort of misogynist ideal you might have if you're going to a woman constantly as your source of information. So I think as this revolution continues, you'll see more poignant changes take place in the Sudanese, consciousness. But again, there will always be people who would rather sort of support the regime just because they don't want anything different.
The rise of an Arab NATO.
I mean, we laugh it, but it's materializing before our eyes. And what's happening, simple fact that the Gulf Cooperation Council is anything but defunct for the last 3 years. The fact that Qatar's isolation as far as its neighbors is complete. And then the fact that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been mulling another sphere where it's less threatened. I mean, they have the headache of Iran to deal with on that side, but they're looking now at, and with the help of Israel and Egypt and Jordan, the Red Sea could become the new regional passage that a new order might come. And if you are to look at the fact that the United Arab Emirates has been trying to secure ports all along the East African coast from Port Sudan, because from southern Egypt actually, because now they have total control of the Halab Triangle, all the way to Somalia, Djibouti, and beyond, even into Mozambique. It becomes clear that there is a new order emerging. Whether it will be an Arab NATO, highly unlikely. How could you have a NATO where it's one country is contributing the forces? We're going to be the America of that NATO? I mean, I wonder what's going to be happening there.
But also, I mean, there's a lot of talk of Hemedti, the UAE supporting Hemedti in getting an air force. And there's also documents that I've seen of him having RSF guys trained as pilots.
Yeah, but can you have, I mean, the level of his fighters are not, they're not, it's not people who have gone to,
troops, so
yeah, but they haven't gone to a military academy, and so actually, I don't know.
Yeah, but it's a matter of time before, something we need to understand is there is a lot of work that could be done on understanding the nature, the structure, and the build-up of the rapid support forces. We haven't done that, but we're talking about a group of people that can recruit from a demographic that stretches literally across the Sahara. We're not talking about a group of people that are limited to the borders of Sudan and Chad. We're talking about people who can recruit from Niger, from CAR, Chad,
Eastern Sudan
Mali,
well.
Eastern Sudan. We're talking about people who can recruit from wherever there is poverty and no education. To come back, are we going to change anytime soon? I fear that the simple fact that there is the idea that everything, you have to get everything with your arm and by the gun, it's a matter of time if the kids who are dying in the streets in Khartoum do not see that they are supported and that there is a viable way to transform, they will revert to guns. And if they revert to guns, then it's over. And I mean, sometimes we come close to it, and then sometimes we're very far away from it. And I don't want to be knocking on about civil war, but the talk is there in those neighborhoods, in Omdurman, in Jabra, in Jiref. Boys are talking. Until when are we going to do? And are we talking about the population that, for better or worse, knows how to use a Kalashnikov?
But I mean, I have to say, after the massacre on June 3rd, the fact that they consistently maintained a peaceful protest is very, very sort of, like, it makes people optimistic that they won't revert to violence. And I remember, do you remember the reports of the mosque calling out for people to take arms? And very quickly people found out that it was actually a truck going around with a megaphone telling people to take arms. People have become, they're aware of the pitfalls and they're aware of the trappings of what's going on, which is, I mean, that's not to say that won't happen, but it's making it sort of more of a rosier future than that they haven't reverted to that already.
You're seeing a, so you're seeing.
I mean, I will go with you. I will go with Yousra for now. And yes, there is a lot of sense of optimism in the simple fact that, you know, we can still mobilize and turn in our hundreds of thousands. But if that gets a second knock and a third knock and a fourth knock, I mean, I'm just looking out now. The next anniversary of a revolution, guys, is the 21st of October. So everyone in this room, take note of the 21st of October, follow Sudan. There's going to be a huge protest on the 21st of October. And if that is, and I'd say that gives us a good 5 months. If between here and there they keep on killing us, I think if there is a huge crackdown on a protest on the 21st of October, things could change.
Can I just quickly go to the RSF? I think the fact that they don't have a military structure actually works to their advantage. So I think dismissing them as not trained or uneducated, I think that is probably the mentality that enabled the RSF and Hemedti to rise to power so quickly. For example, with recruitment with the RSF, you get your ranking, you get a higher ranking when you recruit more people. That's not really how it works in the military, but that helps it expand and it helps it grow. So I think we're not going by the rules at all. And that's been his biggest advantage, is that he does not play by the rules.
No,
he
but
does
in
what he
terms
wants.
of strategy, in terms of military strategy, I mean, at the end of the day, they're used as cannon fodder.
I'm aware we're running out of time, so if we could just briefly, we haven't got time for more questions, I'm afraid, but if we just briefly consider the last couple. So the role of Islamists in Sudan, I mean, one thing that really struck me was you had so many chants, protests against the Islamists within the city and elsewhere, and yet at the same time there are lots of people within Sudanese society who would define themselves as an Islamist even if they dislike Bashir, or if they felt these people have been too corrupt, but they didn't dislike the idea. Is the idea of Islamism over in Sudan, or is that still a constituency that will have to be paid attention to?
I mean, I think, yeah, the Kazan anti-Islamist, anti-Kazan chants have been really prominent. But I think what shocked me when they started the negotiations is that when it came to the Sharia point, and the TMC came out and said, we are going to use the Sharia law as the basis of our law, I was really shocked by the number of older people that didn't want that. My friends' parents, and then being like, oh, they're going to stick with Sharia. That shocked me because I assumed that all of that generation wanted Sharia, wouldn't want to go back to a secular state. In terms of, we spoke about the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So Qatar, I think we're ignoring Qatar and we're forgetting Qatar's presence. And I think the fact that the TMC shut down the Al Jazeera office, these are, you know, it's war. Like there's something going on, and we can't ignore the fact that Qatar is being isolated when Qatar has so much investment in Sudan, including in the pyramids and antiquity. Where is all
and
this
in peace processes as well.
And in peace process. Where is all this investment going?
And development in Darfur.
So yeah, so Qatar is not going to be on the sidelines for too long. I mean, soon we're going to hear from the Muslim Brotherhood again. We're going to hear from Qatar again. I think in terms of the Islamists, when I was there, they were sort of rallying people. We saw sort of quite famous Islamists, quite famous jihadi Islamists like Abdel Hay come to the fore and try and sort of rally people. They're in the background. They've been for now sort of sidelined, but even within the dispersal of the sit-in, we saw national security forces. Some of my sources said that there were sort of Islamists, armed Islamists. I don't know if it was enough to call a militia, but these are all people that we're ignoring for now that will soon try and stake a claim into a new Sudan or whatever comes out of this negotiation process.
And finally, are we looking at this the wrong way? Does Sudan need to be entirely rethought, a British construct that is no longer of value?
I mean, that's the problem the whole of Africa has post-colonial, you know? Like, what do? We got borders that we can easily stretch them, whatever, bring them down. But I don't think there is time now to rethink. We're going to have to make do of what we have. But I think there is one issue that we've tended to ignore, us, the so-called urban Sudanese or the educated Sudanese, and that's the fact to what extent is the tribe as a unit of identification and mobilization and many things is alive and kicking. We decried tribalism for so long, only for Omar al-Bashir in his last 10 years when he was away from his ideologues and all that he really worked on this tribal card. And just like the tribe is cursing South Sudan, now we're catching the same problem and it's rearing its head. So I think there might not be a Sudan 10 years down the line. I mean, we need to be realistic. We genuinely need to be realistic, because going back to Hemedti and the army and secularism and the spoilers and the Islamists and all these people who are there, for now, the Islamists and Hemedti have a common thing, which is maintaining and preserving as much of the interest and the money and the apparatus and everything they had. And the fact that this crackdown actually went ahead on the 3rd of June with the absence, and there was no participation from the military, the army, as we understand the Sudan Armed Forces. So at any one time, it's NIS and the RSF. When are they going to disagree over the cake? And Qatar is there. They're not meeting the people, but they're there. They're giving you Al Jazeera, blanket, carte blanche, all the time. Al Jazeera is putting so much pressure on the TMC. And just as I was walking in, I've realized now we're moving into the area of bots on Twitter. Now there are hashtags that are being produced by the Saudis and the Emiratis to start smearing up the Qataris and the Turks are the ones who are backing Mohammed Naji al-Assam. We are in a murky region, in a very sinister space where everything is run according to a conspiracy theory, and where all the security people who are in control of us think that Mein Kampf is factual. And these are the people who are practicing politics with us, who are playing politics at our expense. We're not in a place where we can afford to have rosy ideas. You know, this is why I say, when there are young kids in Khartoum saying, listen, there is only so much we can take in protesting before we can go to Kauda. I mean, there are people who are thinking that
Kauda in the Nuba Mountains, i.e. join the rebellion.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I'd just like you to join me in thanking Mohanad, Othaylat, and also the Frontline Club as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.